At summer camp, you're told the woods are safe. Stay on the trails. Stick with your group. Don't wander after dark. They tell you this to keep you out of trouble. But sometimes trouble doesn't need an invitation. In the stillness of the trees, when the fire is just embers and the last flashlight has clicked off, there are things that move, silently watching. Most campers never know they're being watched. Some notice too late. Over the years, a handful of camps have quietly shut their gates forever. The official reasons? Budget cuts, storm damage, low enrollment. The real reasons are buried in reports the public was never meant to see. What you're about to hear are 3 of those stories. True accounts from people who came face to face with something they can't explain. And if you think you'd be safe out there, wait until you've heard what they saw. The crickets had gone silent. Out on the black water of Lake Sycamore, the moon's reflection broke into ripples, as if something just beneath the surface had disturbed it. A single flashlight beam cut through the night, swinging wildly, splashing against tree trunks, catching glimpses of empty cabins in the distance. "Ethan?" The voice cracked across the still air, swallowed by the forest. There was no answer. Only the quiet slap of water against the dock. Behind the sound of the waves, there was something else, so faint you could almost convince yourself you imagined it. A rhythmic tapping like knuckles on wet wood, echoing just beneath the dock planks. It stopped the moment the flashlight beam swept over that spot. They say if you stand out there long enough, you can still hear it, the sound of footsteps rushing past you. But no one's there. It was the summer of 1997, the kind of humid July where the air clings to your skin and even the breeze feels heavy. In the mornings, a thick fog hung over the lake, refusing to lift until nearly noon. The forest smelled of damp pine needles and the faint tang of gasoline from the old aluminum fishing boats the counselors used. Lake Sycamore Camp had been around since the late 1950s, a cluster of aging wooden cabins connected by dirt trails that wound through the trees like veins. The paint was peeling, the screen doors sagged on rusty hinges, and the mess hall roof leaked whenever it rained. Parents sent their kids here not for luxury but because it was cheap, out of the way, and safe, or so they thought. Ethan Barnes was 11. Lanky. Blonde hair that wouldn't stay out of his eyes. He'd been nervous about camp, but his parents promised he'd make friends, learn to swim, maybe even catch a fish or 2. He wasn't the kind of kid who took risks, not the type to wander off or break rules. That was one of the things that made what happened so unsettling. No one could have known it would be his last summer. The day he disappeared started like any other. Morning bugle call. A line of kids shuffling into the mess hall, still half asleep, yawning over plates of scrambled eggs and toast. After breakfast, the counselors divided them into groups. Canoe practice for some, archery for others. Ethan's group had lake duty that morning, practicing how to steer the canoes between the buoys. Witnesses later said Ethan seemed distracted. He would paddle, then stop and just stare across the water toward the far shoreline, where the trees grew thicker and the camp boundary ended. One counselor told police she saw him shielding his eyes from the sun, squinting at something in the distance, though she couldn't see what. By dinner time, the air was buzzing with excitement. The counselors had announced that night's activity, the traditional night hike to the old boathouse, a rotting, abandoned structure on the far shore that the camp used as a ghost story destination. It was harmless fun, until that year. Ethan didn't want to go. His bunkmate later said Ethan had been unusually quiet all day, his hands fidgeting under the table during dinner, eyes fixed on the trail leading into the trees. The hike started just after sunset. A string of bobbing flashlight beams wound through the pines, bouncing off trunks and tangled undergrowth. The kids laughed and whispered at first, tripping over roots, pretending to be scared. But the deeper they went, the quieter it got. The forest at night changes. Sounds you never noticed in daylight become louder. The crack of a twig, the whisper of wind through high branches, the rush of your own heartbeat in your ears. About About 20 minutes in, the group reached a fork in the trail. The counselors called for everyone to stick together. They took the left path toward the lake. When they counted heads at the boathouse, Ethan wasn't there. At first, they assumed he'd gotten bored and gone back. But when the group returned, his bunk was empty. His shoes were still neatly placed under his bed. His flashlight lay on the pillow. Search teams began combing the camp. First the cabins, then the mess hall, then the dock. By midnight, they were in the forest, their own flashlights jittering over tree trunks and empty clearings. One counselor swore he saw ripples spreading from the center of the lake. Not from wind, but like something had just slipped under the surface. But the water was still moments later. The strangest account came from a boy in cabin 6. He claimed he woke up after everyone else had left for the hike. The cabin door was open. He saw Ethan walking barefoot toward the dock, head tilted as though listening to something just beyond human hearing. 2 days later, deputies found Ethan's shirt. It was tangled on a low branch deep in the forest, almost half a mile from the dock. The fabric was damp, not with rain but with lake water. Across the chest were long, thin scratches, parallel, like something had raked across him. There was no blood, no footprints nearby, no sign of a struggle. Just that shirt, fluttering in the breeze like a warning no one could interpret. Lake Sycamore Camp closed for the season a week later. It never reopened. Ethan Barnes has never been found. But campers from the nearby state park still tell stories. They say if you walk to the dock after midnight, you'll hear footsteps rush past you, though the wood stays empty. And sometimes, if the night is calm enough, the lake gives off that quiet slap of water against the dock, the sound of something, or someone, slipping under the surface. It was just after 3 a.m. when the first scream tore through the stillness. The sound was sharp enough to cut the night in half, shrill, desperate, and full of a terror that didn't sound rehearsed or playful. Most campers thought it was part of the late-night games the older kids sometimes played. But that illusion shattered when the second scream came. It was shorter, almost choked off mid-breath, like someone's mouth had been suddenly covered. The counselors rushed out of their bunks, flashlights scanning across the narrow gravel paths between cabins. Moths batted against the beams of light. Leaves rustled in the dark. From somewhere near the far edge of camp, Cabin 7 stood silent. The door was closed. The curtains were drawn. Inside, they'd find a scene no one at Lake Willows would ever be able to forget. Lake Willows Camp had a reputation for being the quiet camp. No spooky ghost tours, no dangerous hikes, just fishing, crafts, and campfire sing-alongs. It was smaller than most, with only 12 cabins and a horseshoe layout around the main lodge. Cabin 7 was at the farthest point from the lodge, its porch facing the thick tree line where the forest pressed close. The summer of 1985 was unusually hot, with the kind of dry air that made the pine needles brittle underfoot. Nights were cooler though, and the older campers liked to tell stories about the woods. Stories about hunters who never came back, or strange lights seen drifting between the trees. Most were harmless tales, until that July night. Cabin 7 housed 6 campers and 1 junior counselor, 19-year-old Marissa Lane. By all accounts, she was responsible, calm, and kept a strict bedtime. That night, she checked all the windows, made sure the door was bolted, and turned off the lights at 10 p.m. She was still awake when she heard the first noise. It started as a scratching sound on the outside wall, light, hesitant, like the touch of branches in the wind. Except there was no wind that night. The air was heavy and still. Marissa thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon nosing around the trash bins. She decided to wait, listening. Then came the whisper. Low, breathy, impossible to make out, but close. Too close. It seemed to move along the length of the wall, stopping beneath the window at the far corner of the cabin. One of the campers, a boy named Alex, whispered from the top bunk. "Did you hear that?" Before Marissa could answer, the whisper came again, louder, carrying a strange rhythm. as if someone were murmuring the same phrase over and over. The words were foreign, distorted. It made the hairs on her arms rise. She grabbed her flashlight and moved toward the window. Just as she reached it, the first scream ripped through the night. Chaos erupted in the cabin. One of the younger girls began sobbing. Another pulled the blanket over her head. Marissa shouted for everyone to stay in their bunks and locked eyes on the door. Then, silence. She could hear her own breathing, the ticking of the wall clock, the faint creak of the wood as the building settled. Slowly, she began to think maybe it had come from somewhere else in camp. Maybe it wasn't as close as it had sounded. That's when the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle or jerk like someone was trying to force it. It turned slowly, deliberately, all the way to the right, and then back again. Marissa's flashlight beam cut across the room and caught the faces of the campers. All wide-eyed, all frozen. None of them were out of bed. She stepped closer to the door, her heart pounding so hard she felt it in her teeth. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. And then the second scream, closer this time, almost pressed against the walls. The door burst open. Marissa swung her flashlight toward the entry, but the beam caught nothing. Just the empty porch, the tree line beyond it, and shadows that seemed thicker than they should be. The night outside was silent again. But in the middle of the cabin floor, there was something wet. A single, glistening footprint. Bare. Small enough to be a child's. The trail didn't lead toward the door, it led toward the back wall, and stopped. That wall, investigators would later discover, had no crawl space, no trap door, no opening of any kind. By morning, the camp director had called the sheriff's office. Every child in cabin 7 was accounted for, shaken but unhurt. The source of the screams was never found. That summer, half the campers went home early. Cabin 7 was locked and boarded up. To this day, staff claim to hear scratching from inside it on windless nights, followed by a faint, breathy whisper they can't quite translate. But the footprint, they say it never washed away. The lake was supposed to be off limits after dark. That was the rule everyone knew, the one the counselors never broke, except once. And they only broke it because they thought they were saving someone. Around midnight, a faint glimmer of light appeared along the shoreline. It was unsteady, swaying back and forth like someone walking barefoot in the shallows, holding a weak flashlight low to the water. It bobbed in slow rhythm, almost hypnotic. From the main lodge, Daniel saw it first through the window. At first, he assumed it was another counselor checking the canoes, until the light's beam tilted upward and swept the tree line, as if looking for something in the woods instead of the lake. He nudged Megan, who was half asleep in a chair. She rubbed her eyes, squinted toward the water, and frowned. "That's not one of ours." 2 minutes later, they were both outside, hurrying toward the shore. The air smelled of wet pine and something faintly metallic. Their breath fogged faintly in the cool air, though the summer night shouldn't have been that cold. When they reached the dock, the light was gone. In its place, only the still water of Mirror Lake, black as glass. And along the sand, 2 small, perfect handprints, wet as if someone had just pressed them into place. Cedar Pines Camp wasn't much more than a collection of weathered cabins, a mess hall, and a handful of trails winding through a patch of old-growth forest. It had been there since the late 60s, long enough for layers of old graffiti to cover the undersides of bunks, and for the smell of mildew to seep into the wood itself. The lake, Mirror Lake, had always been the camp's centerpiece. Its waters were unervingly calm, reflecting everything with such clarity that even on cloudy nights you could still see shapes moving beneath the surface. The counselors joked about it during the day, but come nightfall, no one lingered near it. In the town nearby, there was an unspoken superstition. The lake had taken a child once, and those who wandered too close after dark risked being invited in as well. Her name had been Emily Rhodes, 12 years old. vanished one summer evening in 1974. Her body was found 3 days later in the shallows, but her face was described only as changed. The official reports avoided specifics. On the night of the sighting, head count had been finished, and the cabins were settling into the muffled quiet that comes right before sleep. From the lodge, the view of the lake was clear. Moonlight laid a silver path across the water. The light they saw wasn't bright, more like the dull flicker of a flashlight with nearly dead batteries. It stayed low to the water, occasionally sweeping the shoreline in slow arcs. The more Daniel watched, the more wrong it felt. Whoever was holding it wasn't walking along the sand. The beam's movement suggested they were in the water, waist deep, moving without a sound. He and Megan exchanged a glance that said the same thing. "We have to check." They grabbed their own lights, stepped out into the night, and headed toward the narrow trail that led to the shore. The air was damp and heavy. The cicadas had gone silent. Every crunch of their footsteps on the gravel seemed uncomfortably loud. When they broke through the tree-line, the dock loomed ahead, pale in the moonlight. The lake lay utterly still. The beam of light they'd been following had vanished. "Hello," Daniel called. His voice came back to him in warped echoes, as if it were bouncing off the water in slow motion. Megan swung her flashlight toward the sand, and froze. There they were. Two small handprints, side by side, pressed deep enough into the wet earth that you could see the slight curve of each finger. The nails, though, the nails were long. Not just untrimmed, almost claw-like, curling ever so slightly at the tips. Daniel crouched. The prints were fresh. Water glistened in their indentations, catching the light in a way that made them look alive. That's when Megan hissed, "Look!" Just at the water's edge, less than 2 feet from the first set, another pair of prints appeared. The sand darkened, indented, but nothing was there to make them. Daniel's light skimmed over the surface of the lake. A pale shape floated just beneath, hair fanning out like a shadowed halo. At first it seemed motionless, then the head tilted up. The eyes were opened too wide, and the mouth stretched far more than it should have. The figure didn't lunge. It simply hovered there, face upturned toward the counselors, staring. The water around it rippled faintly, though no breeze touched the surface. Megan's breathing quickened. "We need to go." But Daniel couldn't move. The girl's lips began to part as if to speak, but instead of words, a stream of bubbles escaped, rising to break the surface in silence. Then, slowly, the figure sank out of sight. The shoreline was empty, the water still. It almost could have been a trick of the light. Then, another splash. Behind them, they spun, lights cutting through the dark. And there she was, standing at the tree-line where the trail met the sand. Her skin was almost translucent, veins like faint blue lines beneath the surface. She wore a faded one-piece swimsuit, the kind no one had made in decades. Her hair clung to her face in strands that didn't drip, didn't move. She tilted her head, slowly. Her eyes didn't blink. Without a sound, she stepped backward into the water. Each step left a perfect, wet handprint in the sand beside her footprints, though her hands never touched the ground. The moment she disappeared beneath the surface, the lake stilled. The air felt heavier. Daniel's light flickered once, and died. They reported everything to the camp director, but by morning, the prints were gone. No one else had seen the light. No one else had heard the splash. That summer was Cedar Pine's last. The official story said financial trouble shut it down. But those who grew up near Mirror Lake tell a different one, that if you walk the shore after midnight, you might see a faint light moving through the water. And if you follow it, you'll find small, wet handprints pressed into the sand beside you. If you enjoyed this story, you might want to leave the lights on tonight, because tomorrow, another true horror tale is waiting for you. Subscribe to step deeper into the mind's abyss, and remember, not every shadow is empty.